What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Meant to have this video up yesterday, but I had no voice. After streaming for 3 straight days the NFL draft, I want to say before I get started on this video, thank you to everybody for all the support you always show on the channel. Always have so much fun doing those live streams with you guys. I'll probably have a live stream up maybe in a couple of days, maybe even by tomorrow, midday, maybe even at night. I'm not sure, where we kind of talk about the whole draft class, digest it as a fan base. I'll answer some of your guys' questions, but I wanted to take a couple of days off after the draft. I want to dive into, though, my initial impression of this draft, which really means nothing at the end of the day. Nobody should come to a final conclusion on this draft class for at least 2 or 3 years till we get to see and analyze these players. Also, I want to point out that this was Joe Schoen's first draft, not just with the Giants, but in the NFL in general. So none of us really had an idea of what type of drafter he is, what he looked for throughout an NFL draft. Everybody drafts differently. Dave Gettleman, for example, even though we rag on him, for the most part, after you got out of round 1, drafted for value. It seemed that way, at least. When you go back and look at his drafts, most of the players that he took, round 2 and beyond, that's where they were supposed to go, or potentially even earlier. When you look at guys like Xavier McKinney, when you look at guys like Lorenzo Carter, several other players, Will Hernandez, that I could point out, people felt like they got value. That wasn't necessarily the case with Joe Schoen, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. The definition of best player available could be completely different from one GM to the next. Best player available for Joe Schoen may be the player that he feels best fits what he's looking to do at a said position. And that's what it seemed to be the approach that Joe Schoen took throughout this draft. In addition to that, as Joe Schoen said when he initially took the job, that he was going to look to get as many swings as he possibly could. He traded back twice in the second round to give himself 2 additional picks. And what I noticed throughout this draft, when you look at the players we drafted and the positions they played, 1, he hit home with positional value. You got an edge rusher and an offensive tackle in the first round. You got a wide receiver in the second round. And he went for, the linebacker and the D tackle position later in the draft. So he hit home with positional value, and he filled as many needs at positions as he possibly could have. And we all know that the Giants have a ton of holes on this roster, and he's looking to bring in young players that he feels are going to fit what he's looking to do with this football team. Off the top of my head, outside of quarterback and I believe running back, if you exclude special teams, I think he drafted a player at basically every position. If you combine both the guard and center spot as interior offensive lineman, he took 2 of those. He took a tackle. He took a tight end. He took a wide receiver. On the defensive side, he took a D tackle. He took an edge rusher. He took a linebacker. He took a cornerback, and he took a safety. So he took every position. You could argue that he should have taken a position potentially earlier than another, but I was always of the mindset that he could really go anywhere from within this draft. The first round, as I said, the next day was a home run, and I think most Giant fans felt that way, and we'll dive into a player-by-player analysis, or at least brief analysis, of what I expect them to bring to the table for the New York Giants. And the 5th pick to me was obvious. I think, obvious at that point. When 3 tackles were still on the board, I thought it was very likely that the Giants were going to go with Kayvon Thibodeaux unless they had a much higher grade on one tackle than another. Schoen came out and said after the fact that they didn't, and they went with the best edge rusher on their board, and that was Kayvon Thibodeaux. An obvious need for this football team, a guy that you could obviously argue at least was the best overall player available on the board. So no Giants fans really cried about that pick outside of a select few. People talked about Kayvon Thibodeaux's personality. I'm not buying into it. I think the guy, when I at least see him, looks like he works his ass off out there on the football field. I think a lot of these pieces and opinions that you hear prior to the draft are to stir up drama, to create, people that have more interest from within the draft. Kayvon Thibodeaux, to me, when I watch him, and apparently I think Authentic told me this on Twitter, O'Hara said it as well, but when I watch him, when I've been watching his highlights leading up into the draft and the day after the draft, he reminds me of Osi Umenyiora in terms of his first step. His first step is off the charts explosive, and he is going to be a problem at the nenext level. Make no mistake about it. He also possesses more strength than a guy like Osi Umenyiora does as well. I think he's 6'4", about 250-ish. And he has a really quick first step. Sure, does he need to work on some things? Yeah, but that's most rookies. He needs to develop more pass rush moves, but his ceiling at the position is as high as I think any prospect in this draft. So I think the Giants made a great pick here, and I think Thibodeaux is going to fit in just fine for this football team. Expect him to have a big rookie season with Don Wink Martindale calling the plays. Next up was an obvious pick. They had to go tackle here. It was just a matter of which one did they prefer. Micah McFadden was already off the board for the Giants, so then it came down to Neal or Cross. We heard a lot of rumblings that the Giants thought Cross could fit what they were looking to do on the offensive line. In the end, they went with Evan Neal. And I think most people probably feel that that is the safer pick there and probably the guy that may even have more upside. Evan Neal, of course, has played on the right side before, which is where you're going to assume he's going to be playing for the Giants, somewhere Charles Cross never played. And Neal just seemed to me, at least, to be the more complete prospect with the higher ceiling. Cross was known to be a little bit better in terms of pass protection. So I thought that there were arguments for both, but I was thrilled when the Giants took my dream pick with Evan Neal. And I'm going to buy his jersey as quickly as I can. And suddenly, the New York Giants have a strength at the tackle position. Now you have bookend tackles for what you hope is the next 10 to 15 years. So after the first round, I don't think anybody could argue with what the New York Giants did unless you were trying to be super pessimistic. You have to love these first two picks. After that is when you're going to get a difference of opinion. But before I start going over some of the players, let me say this. You're always going to have a difference of opinion after you get outside of the first round because there's so many players to pick from. And did Joe Schoen do as what I expected of a fan, exactly what I thought he would? No. I always thought it was possible that the New York Giants would go wide receiver in the second round, even though I thought cornerback safety was probably more likely. I definitely opened up to the possibility of them taking a wide receiver in the second round and was even kind of for it. I didn't necessarily think that Wendell Robinson was going to be that pick. After that, did they take some players that we expected as fans to take? Not necessarily, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Before I get into all these players, think about prior drafts with Dave Gettleman. As a fan, ask yourself this. Did you love the Will Hernandez pick? How did that turn out? Did you love the Lorenzo Carter pick? How did that turn out? You know, and I could say several others after the draft and ask you if you love them. And a lot of them don't really work out in your favor. I think this was a clear example, and I think we'll get more adjusted to this as a fan base as Joe Schoen continues to draft for this football team, of Joe Schoen identifying players, their skill sets, and saying that is exactly what I want in a football player, and I think I could maximize his potential. And we'll see if Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are able to do that, but that is, in fact, what the best organizations in football do. Our second-round pick after we traded down twice was Wendell Robinson. And my initial reaction on draft night was I was a bit surprised. I did a little research on Wendell Robinson. The reason being is I heard rumors that the Giants may trade Kadarius Toney. And one receiver I consistently heard of in this draft class that was most similar to Kadarius Toney was Wendell Robinson. So I said to myself, okay, it is very likely we could potentially draft this guy if we were to trade Toney when we started to hear those rumors that came out that proved to be false. When Toney was back, when they took Robinson, my initial expectation, I was a bit surprised. He's 5'8", he's 179 pounds. He projects to be a guy in the slot, a guy that is versatile, a guy you can move around, you could use him in the backfield, could potentially be a special teams contributor. But when I sat back for about 8 or 10 minutes and thought about it, I said to myself, okay, I cannot look at this under the lens of a Jason Garrett-led offense. I cannot look at this under the lens of a Joe Judge coach football team. This is Brian Daboll. This is Mike Kafka. And we have to see the scheme that they draw up before we start to criticize some of these picks. For all we know, they're going to want multiple receivers similar to the skill set of a Kadarius Toney that could do a lot of different things. I expect the New York Giants to come out in a lot of 4-wide sets this year to be really creative in terms of their pre-snap motion at the wide receiver position. So while I'm probably not in love with this pick initially, that doesn't mean that Wendell Robinson can't prove to be a really good pick for the New York Giants. You also saw a lot of videos on Twitter of him bench pressing 225 pounds 19 times, where that doesn't really transition on the football field in terms of him being a route runner. It's still really impressive. And the initial impression I get from Wendell Robinson is this is a guy that loves playing football. Just based off some of the interviews that I've seen, that's the vibe I get, and that is something that you hear fans talk about that they don't love about Toney. We also have to realize that a lot of wide receivers on this team may not be in the long-term plans of the New York Giants. Shepard's not going to be here much longer. Slayton's not going to be here much longer. Galladay will be here for another year or two, but he's not going to be here much longer. We don't know with Kadarius Toney how long he's going to be here. He wasn't drafted by Joe Schoen, so they're drafting guys that they believe in, think that could be here for a really long time. Word also came out that the Kansas City Chiefs were really interested in Wendell Robinson and may have taken him in the second round had the New York Giants not. So I'm not going to give any grade on any of these picks because I think it's way too early to do so, but I could at least understand why the New York Giants went this route. Next up, our first pick in the third round at number 67 overall. Let me start off by saying I love that the New York Giants took 2 offensive linemen with their first 5 picks. I said it on Twitter time and time again. That is what I want to see the New York Giants do. Was this the offensive lineman that I necessarily expected them to take? No, they took Joshua Azudu out of North Carolina, and you'll notice that we took another offensive lineman out of North Carolina later on in the draft that we'll talk about briefly as we go along. And you have to think that the Giants probably looked at that program as a similar blocking scheme to what they're looking to bring here to the New York Giants. So again, it's another circumstance of them identifying a player that they feel is exactly what they're looking for at a said position that you may not have it ranked as high as another interior offensive lineman. And I think that's what they did here. They view that Azudu is the best available player at the guard spot for what they're looking to run with the New York Giants. That's my opinion on the matter. I'm not speaking for Joe Schoen. When you look at Azudu, there's not a lot of highlight clips of him on YouTube. You do see his combine and his drill. He does look like he's really nimble on his feet. The other thing that he brings at about a 6'5", 308-pound frame is the ability to play both positions. He started at both the tackle and the guard spot well at North Carolina. North Carolina also runs a lot of RPOs, and like I said, they probably feel like he transitions to what they're looking to do as an offense with this football team. I don't think Azudu will be an immediate contributor. That remains to be seen. Maybe he has a great training camp. My guess will be he will come in as a depth piece that may eventually transition into the starter at some point during the 2022 season, but seems to be a little bit of a developmental piece, which you kind of expect as you get into the 3rd round. But regardless, it was important for the Giants to start to address some depth on that offensive line. And after this draft, you have to absolutely love it as a Giants fan. Between free agency, UDFAs, and the draft, the Giants have brought in, I believe, 10 offensive linemen. So there's going to be a lot of competition, especially at that guard position. Next up, with their second pick in the 3rd round, at 81st overall, the Giants took Cordell Flatt. Now, Flatt, I should have done a little bit more research leading into the draft. I was aware that they brought him in for a top 30 visit. So I wasn't shocked that we drafted him. I was a little surprised perhaps that he went this early. But again, I'm going to give them an opportunity with these players, and I'm sure it's another scenario where they feel he fits what they're looking to do. Flatt was a very versatile player. He played a little bit outside. He played predominantly in the slot well at LSU, but by all accounts, he at least projects to be a guy that could play on the outside. He's pretty tall. He's almost 6'1". He ran I think it was a 4.4, around there, 40. So he has some speed. He has some height. He is underweight. He weighs about 165, 170 pounds. You see some places where they say 175, but he needs to put on probably 15 pounds or so of muscle to play on the boundary position long term. Much like Azudu, I think Flatt will probably be a guy that comes in his depth that could potentially transition into becoming a starter at some point, possibly in the 2023 season, but I think they went for upside here. I think they saw the physical skill set of a guy with his height, his speed, and they didn't get one of the top corners in the 1st round, which they may have been eyeing, but of course 2 corners went in the first 4 picks, and they said, all right, Flatt is a guy we could see eventually being a long-term answer for this team. If he were to play for the Giants this year, I guess it's likely that he could potentially play in the slot. And I think with this pick, it signifies that it is at least increasingly likely that James Bradberry will actually be back with the New York Giants due to the fact that we don't really have a guy that could step in and you could trust on that outside cornerback spot after this draft. It'll be interesting to see what they do with the salary cap in order to keep James Bradberry on this roster. But again, another pick I think for upside. Next up, we've got Daniel Bellinger, one of my favorite picks in this year's draft class. Daniel Bellinger, I think he's about 6'5", 253. He's a throwback tight end. He's exactly what I wanted the New York Giants to draft. I got asked countless times leading up into the draft, Chris, what type of tight end do you want the New York Giants to draft? I said I wanted a guy that was a blocker first, that had the capability of catching the football. A couple of my subscribers on the live stream brought up comparisons to what we were hoping Kyle Rudolph could be for this football team and getting him at a much more affordable rate. That is exactly what I think Daniel Bellinger could be for this team. And he does possess athletic upside. He ran a 4.63 at his combine, to put that in comparison of a former Giant tight end who at least possesses a similar skill set. Kevin Boss, I believe, ran about a 4.78. So he's more athletic than Boss was coming out of college. Both of them are thought to be good blockers, capable blockers. Bellinger also did not drop a pass all of last season well at San Diego State. So he's sure-handed. I think he has at least the capability of stepping in and being the day one starter for the Giants football team. And if that happens at pick 112, well, that's a pretty good pick. and we'll see how Bellinger develops as a New York Giant. But I'm actually really excited about this pick, and this was one of my favorite picks that the New York Giants made. Next up, we've got Dane Benton. Benton, again, you're going to notice a theme throughout this draft class: versatility. Dane Benton played the safety spot, but he also played strong side linebacker as well as slot cornerback well at Iowa. He had 5 interceptions, and again, a huge need. When you look at the Giants football team this year, of course, we lost Peppers, we lost Logan Ryan, and Benton, much like Bellinger, at least has an opportunity to potentially start this year, being that we're pretty thin at that position. Julian Love has no ties to this staff. We don't know how they feel about him in terms of the safety position on this roster. I actually do think he fits relatively well. He's kind of a guy that could do multiple things. His nickname last year was Duct Tape because of that, because you can move him all over. So I do think Wink will find a value with him. But Dane Benton has potential to be a day one contributor for this football team at a position where we needed a lot of help. He's a hard hitter from what I've seen in terms of the highlight tapes. He also seems like he has a nose for the ball in terms of being able to punch the ball out, create turnovers. So I like this pick by the Giants as well. Another need filled, solid pick. And I think that's around where he was supposed to go. Now we got Micah McFadden coming out of Indiana. He's a little bit undersized. I think he's 6'1", 240 pounds. He's a middle linebacker. Was thought to be a very good high school prospect coming into college, at least from what I read. A lot of people project him at this point in time to probably be a special teamer, which is more than likely what he'll be. But I could see him being used situationally with the New York Giants. He's a guy that, at least I see, he's got average to slightly below average athleticism for the position, but he has really good instincts, and he seems to be good in terms of utilizing the blitz up the middle at the linebacker position. So I could see him being used in third down situations in his rookie season with the Giants, and we know we're really thin at that linebacker position. We got Tate Crowder, we got Martinez coming off the injury. So the Giants drafted both McFadden, and we'll get to another linebacker that they drafted later in this draft. So I was glad to see that they addressed that position at some point in this draft. But McFadden could be a really good scheme fit for this Giants football team. Next up, you got DJ Davidson, and quite simply, this guy is he's a nose tackle in every sense of the word. Not a very good athlete. I think he got like a 4.5 on his RAS score, but he's a guy that you're going to stick in the middle and you're going to try to clog up the run. You're going to use him on obvious running down situations, third and short, things like that, depending on the opponent you're going up against. Maybe you use a player like this a little bit more often than not. But, you know, he's a guy that he's a run stuffer. He's 327 pounds, something that we may need long-term, and a guy that you could at least use situationally on the goal line, third and short, fourth and short situations. So it fills a need. It's not a sexy pick. You're not going to get super excited about it. And I know you're projected to go a bit later, but a guy that the Giants obviously identified would fit what they're looking with for this defense. Next up, you got Marcus McKeen. This guy is gigantic. I think he's 340 pounds. By comparison, the other North Carolina lineman that we drafted, Joshua Azudu, is 308 pounds. So he's a big boy, right? He's a big guy, 6'6", 340. Not nearly as nimble when you watch him at his combine tape, but a guy that's going to project, you know, as a long-term piece for this team. And at a bare minimum in the 5th round, you're getting some good depth, or at least you hope getting some good depth on this offensive line. And much like I said earlier with Azudu, I think it's probably a guy that they feel coming from the North Carolina program is what they're looking to bring in with their offensive linemen. And then finally, our last pick here is going to be Darien Beavers, which seemed to be very well received by New York Giants fans at pick number 182. And once again, they double up at the linebacker position. Probably right now, most people have him penciled in to be a special teams contributor, but with how thin we are at that position, I would not be surprised at all if Beavers gets an opportunity at some point this year at that spot. He's not a guy that's going to really drop back in coverage. I know his coverage numbers while at college were pretty good, but he's not like an incredible athlete. What you read on him is he's kind of a phone booth linebacker, meaning he's a downhill linebacker, a guy that's going to identify the run. He's a hard hitter. He's nasty from what you see. So I think this is going to be a fan favorite for this football team, and hopefully he makes an impact day one. But regardless, I think this draft, you have to give it some time. You can't flip out as a Giants fan because Joe Schoen did not follow your mock draft. He's going to draft the way that he sees fit. He's going to identify players that he feels fit, what they're looking to bring to this football team. And quite frankly, he doesn't care that Wendell Robinson was projected to go 70th or 80th overall if he feels he's the best wide receiver on the board for what they're looking to do for this football team. I'm not saying they knocked it out of the park outside of the first round, which I absolutely love. I'm saying take a wait-and-see approach, or at least that's what I'm going to do. We don't know how any of these players are going to turn out. There's been several players, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, second, third, fourth-round picks that I've heard several Giants fans tell me, what a steal, how did they get him here? And they don't turn out to be much. And there's been players in the past that had the opposite effect, that maybe you didn't necessarily like later in the round, that turned out to be a pretty damn good football player. It's Joe Schoen's first year evaluating players, his first draft. He also has no ties to any of the scouts on this roster. Next year will really be where he has a full offseason, where he's comfortable with all the scouts and everybody else on this New York Giants roster to continue to build this football team. But I think the moral of the story with this draft is you got two definitive high impact, immediate impact players in this draft, and you hope to get some other contributions from 2, 3, 4 players in this draft between, rounds 2 and 6 that you drafted with those other 9 picks long term. In 3 or 4 years, if Evan Neal turns out to be what we think he can be, which is an above average tackle, and obviously Thibodeaux turns out to be at least a borderline Pro Bowler year in and year out on the outside, similar to a guy like Osi Umenyiora, we'll look back at this draft with smiles. That's what it'll come down to. I'm excited to see how it all works out this season as the New York Giants continue to get younger with this football team. As always, guys, if you like what you watch, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.